I had all of my job offers by February. So my MBA started in September, which is basically through the midpoint, which is a good time to be, right? Which therefore meant that I could really kind of have a blast in the next 6 months. What I'd say is a good application is when the other person doesn't need to ask me why you're doing this, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. That journey should be very fluid.
Yeah.
Even if it's not on paper, you should be able to kind of the other person, the reader should be able to visualize it. The other thing that can help with a lower score is, of course, great companies you've worked at. Brands matter. It shows that, rightly or not so rightly, right? I'm of the opinion that it shouldn't, but it does.
Hello, aspirants. Today, I'm talking to Pranjal Begwani. He is an associate with McKinsey & Company with a rich experience with big names like Amazon, UNICEF, Deloitte, and many more. Pranjal is going to answer some of the most asked questions like how to get admission to Cambridge for an MBA, is it worth getting an MBA from abroad, how should one judge which MBA school is right for them, and many more. You can use the chapters to fast forward to a specific part of the video, and my recommendations are highlighted with a star. These sections are a must watch if you're planning to pursue an MBA from abroad. So without any further delay, let's start the Videshi Chai podcast. I love data. It resolves misinformation. Let's talk to experts, analyze news, and smartly plan your study abroad journey. Hello aspirants, welcome to Videshi Chai. Hi Pranjal.
Hi Janesh.
Welcome to Videshi Chai.
Thank you.
To kick things off, and especially since you've lived in the UK, the first question is, what's your preference, coffee or chai?
It actually depends on the day. So I'm good with either. Today it looks like I don't have much of an option, so I'll go with chai. But no, it really depends. Don't have. Very flexible with it.
Pranjal, could you take a minute to introduce yourself to our viewers and especially talk about your journey and highlight a bit on where you're working right now?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Pranjal. I have most recently done an MBA from the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Currently working as an associate at McKinsey & Company, doing a bunch of projects across India, and sometimes, depending on the engagement, can be outside of India as well. Previous to my MBA, I have experience across management consulting, social impact consulting, and I've worked with the government of Haryana as well in political, social role, and amalgamation to both.
Correct.
So that's largely been some of the experiences that has led me to the MBA and what I'm doing right now.
So at McKinsey, do you already have a specialization or is it diversified across sectors?
So typically the way it works is when you join as a management consultant immediately after business school, you do have about, I'd say, close between 2 to 4 years to really specialize.
Got it.
Right? So I have worked across multiple industries, sectors, really kind of figuring out what my sweet spot is. I know what I want to focus on. But your first couple of years is really when you get the chance to experiment, and you should really take that.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been doing.
So how does one get into the University of Cambridge for an MBA?
So let me try to go back, right? There are a bunch of factors which are important and critical for any MBA, for that matter, right? And we can get to what is maybe given a lot more weightage at a European MBA and specifically at an MBA at Judge, which is Cambridge. But typically, of course, one is the score you get, which is a GMAT or a GRE. So that's important. More so in US schools. In European schools, it's a lot more of the entire profile that makes a whole bunch of difference, right? You can maybe have a little bit lower of a score, but if you have great experience, you can still get into a really good school. So of course, there's the score, then there's the experience, right? That can be the kind of impact you've driven on the ground, and can also be some of the big brand name firms that you've worked at. And both of them can add value in different ways to an application. And then, of course, the third, and which I tell most applicants I speak to, which is the most critical, is how you narrate that story, how you join the dots of what you've done currently to what you want to do post the MBA, and to what you want to do 5 years down the line and then 10 years down the line. Someone who would have had maybe a very traditional journey, but if they kind of narrate the story really well, I'd say is a stronger application than someone who's done great stuff but can't put it out across. And that's also a little bit of a challenge that comes out when you join an MBA, because the job market outside of India is not centered on placement cells. You really need to put yourself out there. So communication is very important previous to getting through the MBA and after. Now getting to your question about what is important or how I got through the Cambridge MBA. So one factor for me was it's a 1-year MBA program. I was looking at 1-year MBAs. And the second was, of course, the usual set, right? I gave the GRE. No reason why, right? Like I just so happened to give the GRE, worked out with the score I wanted. Then there are a bunch of essays you have in each business school. They keep changing the essays every couple of years, so it won't make sense for me to really go deep there. But of course, you have the usual essays, and then once you do get a call post that, if the profile works out, then you have an interview with a faculty member. Typically, the interviews are very different, and we can get to that later, right? School-wise. So the judge interview is very, very different from some of the other schools. And then once you're through the interview, then of course, there are a bunch of other stuff, right? You apply for scholarships. The way Cambridge and Oxford work is you also apply to get into a college. Right? Once you get into the business school, you also have to apply to get into a college. And I can maybe explain later what that means. What is the college structure in Oxbridge? Specifically,
you mentioned your essay, work experience, your test score. What tips would you have for somebody or what advice would you have for somebody who has, let's say, a decent GRE score, nothing, let's say a 310, nothing too fancy, has, let's say, 4 years of work experience.
Right.
What advice would you have for them to kind of put the application together in the right light so that they get that interview call?
Right. So as I said, one is, of course, how you narrate the story, which is very important to link. Say if you've done a bunch of stuff across those 4 years, right? You have, say, one applicant who has done 2 years at an X company, then 1 year at Y and 1 year at Z in different industries. I had done something similar, right? I had done work for a couple of years in management consulting at Deloitte, then worked with the government of Haryana for a year, worked with UN for another year. So it's a bunch of stuff, right? When people looked at my resume, they're like, okay,
where are you going with this?
This is really interesting, but where are you going with this? But that's life, right? One thing leads to another, and they don't know that, right? So what I'd say is a good application is when the other person doesn't need to ask me why you're doing this, right? So that's one. That journey should be very fluid. Even if it's not on paper, you should be able to kind of the other person, the reader should be able to visualize it. The second thing, which I often see missing in essays and which I think really adds a lot of value is adding character to the essay, right? Who you are as a person. People usually list down a bunch of achievements. I've done X, Y, Z. It's like a laundry list. But you're missing out on who you are. And that's what an MBA application admission committee is really interested in, right? Your voice. And especially in the age of ChatGPT, where I'm sure a bunch of people kind of revise, review, maybe add elements as well. One way to really differentiate is if you can push across who you are as a person, right? What really drives you? What really motivates you? What are some of your values? And these can kind of like fit in while you're talking about your experiences, right? So I would say it's very important to talk about these and then read your own essay as a third person and see if you can get a sense of what your likings and dislikes are. And if you can, I think that's a good essay. And that really kind of helps sandpaper over some of the things you might not have done. The other thing that can help with a lower score is, of course, great companies you've worked at. Brands matter. It shows that, I mean, rightly or not so rightly, right? I'm of the opinion that it shouldn't, but it does, unfortunately. And the reason being that, of course, that shows that, you know, you've already gone through a bunch of checks and balances and it's easier to kind of take you through because someone's already vetted you. That's the reasoning behind why it matters. So, of course, if you have a lower score, but if you have a great brand, that's another way to kind of get it.
I also feel like it's also about known versus unknown. So great brands are known. They're known quantities.
Absolutely.
People don't have to apply, the admission committee doesn't have to apply their mind, judging whether it's a genuine competition versus not.
As I said, it's almost like a vetting process which the candidate has
already gone through.
Right. So if you've worked at like a great investment banking firm, it kind of shows, okay, you have the basic quant skills. You might not have the greatest score on tests. Maybe you're not great on giving tests, but you still have the aptitude, right? So think like that.
Which round did you apply to? And does Cambridge have rounds?
It does. It does have a bunch of rounds, actually. It has 5 rounds, 4 to 5 rounds. I applied, I'm not wrong, in the 3rd round.
Okay.
So I can, in fact, if you want to talk about some of the schools I applied to, I can walk through that.
That would be
I looked at 1-year MBAs. I applied to 4 schools. ISB, Oxford Side, Cambridge Judge, and NCR. ISB was the first round. So I studied at Ashoka, and I felt Ashoka and ISB have similar cultures. Right? I visited the campus. Felt like a similar vibe. Also, I was shown because I studied in India all my life. I felt that, and the reason being that MBA is a very social program, I felt that doing it outside of India would be a great value add. Typically, MBAs in India are very, very academic. MBAs outside of India are a lot more social. And at least I believe that 80% of the learning in an MBA happens outside of the classroom. So there was that, right? My reasoning behind applying to some of the schools I did. ISB was a little bit, the application was, so I got through 3 of these schools, which is ISB, Syed, and Judge. ISB was the first school I applied to, so I was also able to get some of my essays vetted and get a sense of what's working and what's not. And then some of the other schools came in after that. By the time I had paid in my fees at Judge, I also had a conditional invite to interview at NCR. But we had that investment, I explored some of the post-MBA options. Typically, if you get a good role, it's similar. So I thought since I've already kind of put in my money, might as well go for it.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's how that happened.
You mentioned reading your own essays to judge for yourself as a third person. But I've typically seen friends, and when I was applying for my B school as well, I took help from seniors, friends, and actually from an independent consultant as well to judge my essays and give me advice. Did you have outside help? And if so, of what nature and what kind of help did you get from that?
Yeah, of course. It's always a village that's required for you to get anywhere. Like it's without the support, without the community around you, it's really hard. So I had some of my closest friends, all my associates, point of view. I had some alumni of schools that I was applying to also kind of give their feedback. I would recommend applicants to do that.
Yeah.
And some of the, and that's also a great way to judge a school. Our alumni response.
Yeah.
They get back. Who they share? Are they very centric about what they advise on their specific things? And when you speak to them, you also get a sense of where they've worked at. So that's a great first base for you to even know that, is this a school that fit in well? Or do I really want to apply here? And that's something I did, right? So I'd say friends, family, and alumni.
Yeah.
So I also had an MBA consultant.
Got it.
And that's of course very helpful, right? When you apply to multiple schools, it helps kind of keep you sticking to your deadline. There's a bunch of them typically.
And applying while you're working is also challenging because you have to put in a lot of work.
It is. Applying while you're working is quite challenging. So I'd recommend not saving it for the last, taking time with it. And most applicants save it for they're writing their essays the night before. I actually ended up submitting my ISB application past the deadline. So it went through, fortunately. But I'd recommend don't do what I did.
Yeah.
Plan it out well and give the GRE team well in advance to have that clear with the school.
Yeah.
As you get sharp, itna aa jayega, so basis that I'll do X, Y, Z. Just have that score, be done with it, and then you can focus only on the FA and networking, talking to people, talking to AdCom.
Yeah.
Reaching out to AdCom, too, is something you can be directly from the student what applying.
And in my view, taking your test early also gives you the option of taking the test again, which is
100%.
I took my GMAT in 2014. It was 5 years after I had graduated. So I graduated in 2009 and it took me effort to, get the formulas back and whatnot. Right. Let's talk a bit about your experience at Judge.
Yeah.
So specifically about the quality of professors, the diversity of your classmates, also the quality of your classmates. Just tell us a little about your experience overall and any points that you would want to highlight.
Sure. That's a very broad question, right? With a university like Cambridge, there's a whole lot you can talk about also because it's in a way, it's very atypical to your standard MBAs, right? Because once you're in an environment such as a Cambridge or Oxford, there's so much you can do outside of the business school, right? And there's a good time to, in fact, talk about the fact that you're part of 2 communities in the Oxford setup. You're part of the institute, which is the MBA, which for me, say, was the Judge Business School.
Yeah.
And then you're part of a college. Colleges, the way they work in the UK, so Cambridge has 31 colleges, around 30. 31 is the number, might have it off by plus or minus 1. But you typically apply to the top 3 colleges of your choice. And then the colleges select you as well. So in a Cambridge Oxford, it's really 2 rounds of application, right? Once you need to get through the MBA first, then of course there are a bunch of scholarships, and then the college, right? You need to apply to a college, and the way I selected my college was one, proximity to the business school, to the nature of students, right? Undergrads versus PhDs, and what kind of social set I wanted around me, right? And 3, the heritage of the college, because you spend a lot of time there, you eat your meals there, you kind of party there, socialize there, you use the common rooms, you have access to that entire kind of sports network of that college. So that makes a whole lot of a difference. So once you join Cambridge, you're part of not just the business school, you're also part of a college, which means you have networks in both setups, right? So I would have, my neighbors in where I was the residence I was staying at, would say folks who are doing brain studies and a PhD in polar studies and stuff you've never heard of in your life, right? And they're studying that for 5 years or a bunch of years, however long it takes for them to complete their PhD. So it's great. It's a great experience. If I want, I can do lectures or, I don't know, maybe some courses as well outside of the business school too. So that's great. That's something you don't get the chance to. And in fact, I'm reminded about an anecdote about what I feel differentiated, say, a Cambridge or an Oxbridge experience from some of the other schools. Say, one of my economics professor, he was taking a lecture. The 5-minute break, he was dissecting a painting, right, in between a lecture.
Yes.
That's not something you'd expect. That's not something that would happen in business schools. And that one anecdote in a way tells you how different an experience it would be. It's a magical year at Cambridge. It's not just about the MBA, is what I'd say. It's about everything else as well. There are 700 plus societies. Again, I won't put a number because it's 700 to 800. Bunch of societies, you can do so much, right? For instance, I did fencing. I was part of all possible alcohol societies on campus. So I was doing blind wine tasting. So blind wine is basically you put like 6 wines in front of you. You don't like put anything on your eyes. That's literally not the blind you're doing, but you smell the wine, you taste the wine, and then you kind of have to take a guess on what the grape varietal is, which country it is from, which year it is from to some extent. And there are ways to do it, right? So that's a society I joined. I spent a lot of time with that society. Very cool. It was a very academic experience, but I initially joined it for the wines. Took back a lot with me because the kind of wines you get to try there are amazing. Yeah. I was also part of another couple of societies, right? Specifically just the wine society where, you have estates who come and kind of like make us taste their wines. And then there's a whiskey society, which I just did. The whiskey society, if you just do one tasting, then you're just like, okay, this is not something you can do every day, right? Yeah. But yeah, no, it's a very, very kind of different experience. You learn a lot socially and a bunch of stuff outside of just pure academics. And it'll add a lot of value to whatever you do post the MBA. It's not something you would maybe, be conscious of immediately. Yeah. But it's something you realize down the line.
I'm sure you keep in touch with your classmates.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Some of my closest friends are from the MBA because I think this is a time when I think there's that maturity in everyone, right? You know what you really like, what drives you. And therefore the circles you build are also a function of who you are. Yeah. And they are a close set of friends, right? I'd say post-school, maybe equally close set of friends would be those from the MBA. I have a bunch of my friends in the UK as well, because of course, a large percentage, most of them end up working in the UK. I was looking at working in the UK as well. It just, again, so happened that I came back to India for personal reasons. But I was interning with Amazon in London. I had a few job offers in London as well. And I was looking to work in the UK. That's why I went. That's why I wanted to study outside of India. But yeah, I mean, then life happens, and then. But I'm really happy coming back to India. It's been great.
Cool. Right. So one question that we get asked by MBA aspirants is that how do you prepare for MBA interviews? Because that's something that's not really predefined. MBA application is predefined. Tests are predefined. Yeah. Interviews can take different directions.
So I'll talk about how I prepared for my interview, and then maybe the viewers can pick up something from some of what I did, right? Of course, once you get past the essays, specifically for Oxford and Cambridge, once you get to the interview round, it's a lot To some extent, they've said, okay, we really like you, and this is just like a formal final wedding.
Yeah.
Unlike maybe the US schools where it is, again, another round where you're as likely to get eliminated maybe as admitted.
Yeah.
So there's that one factor to keep in mind. It really, your interviews and the way they function are going to be very different in the schools you're applying to. So do your research.
Yeah.
That's one. Two, what I did for my interviews was I had an Excel for every school, right? For the top 10, 20 questions that are asked. Typically, if you Google, you'll get like a bunch of questions which have been asked in previous interviews. So you should have answers to all of them for every school customized, right? Like a tab for every school. That's what I had. And go as deep as possible, right? Because everyone gives those standard generic answers you can get off Google. And typically what I would do again is, because I'd spoken to a bunch of alumni for every school I was interviewing with, I would, of course, also alumni or even say professors in some cases, it's a good idea to talk or name the alumni, because typically business schools are close-knit communities. Professors tend to know students as well. It's a good way to kind of bond with the person who's interviewing you. That's second. Third is ask good questions. Very important. So prepare your questions in advance. Right? Don't be like in the moment ask questions. And those questions shouldn't be something you can, as a thumb rule, if you Google it, you shouldn't get the answer.
Yeah.
Right? That's a good question. So if you are wondering if it's a good question or not, just Google it. And the answer to that should be something which you can't just easily get off the internet. And lastly, read up on your interviewer. That makes a whole lot of a difference. For instance, my interviewer was a professor, and I had read up on which course he takes, which papers he's written. And we had very, very deep conversations about, or specific conversations about some of the elements he had focused on his papers or what he teaches in the course. And we went really deep there. And that changes the whole narrative of the interview, right? It shows how interested you are, how you would maybe add value to a class, right? That interest reflects some of what you would bring to an MBA. So the more research you do, the more you read up, the less generic you are, will always kind of add value.
Yeah, in my experience, that reminds me that there are two ways an interview can go. Majority of the interviews are led by the interviewer, but an interview can also be led by an interviewee.
Yeah.
If you have.
Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned it, because my experience with Cambridge was very different. And that's also one of the reasons why I really liked it. It felt very different. I really liked my experience with the AdCom, with the interview itself. So in my case, and this was a little idiosyncratic, may not happen with everyone, but at Judge, most MBAs have AdCom panels or admission professionals who interview you. In some cases, maybe alumni in some US schools. At Judge, it's usually professors who interview you. In my case, it was a professor, and it was a 30 to 40 minute interview. He flipped it on me, right? He spent 10 minutes asking me questions, and he put it on me to ask him questions for 30 minutes.
Oh, God.
Right. So I mean, of course, I had 2 to 3 questions, but then the rest of it is completely off the script, right? And it was lovely, right? I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Again, it's of course not easy to be able to talk at length or to ask specific questions which are meaningful questions in those 30 minutes. But yeah, that was my experience. I enjoyed it, and I felt myself vibing with the entire setup of Judge. That's also one of the reasons why I went for it over the other schools I had admit strong.
Yeah. And then MBA versus other management programs, did you look at them as an option at all?
Other management programs such as an MIM.
MIM, yeah.
Okay, so an MIM and MBA are very different programs, right? MBA is typically for folks who have a fair amount of experience. The roles you'll get after an MBA are very different from roles post an MIM, right? Significantly, right?
Yeah.
And there'll be a significant difference in the pay scale as well. So an MIM is basically, in very simple terms, if you don't have experience post an undergrad, you do an MIM. If you have a few years of experience, I'd recommend applying to an MBA and not an MIM.
Got it. Yeah. But earlier career professionals, making a choice between working first and then doing an MBA later versus an MIM early.
Yeah.
I think that becomes a worthy question to answer. What do you do rather?
So for an Indian undergrad who studied in India, you could do an MIM if you want to work outside of India immediately, right? If the first job you want to do outside of India is outside of India, then it makes sense to do an MIM, right? Say if you do an MIM, I think an LBS maybe offers it. I'm not sure. Maybe an NCR as well, right? And you get those job opportunities outside of India. I know folks who've done that.
Yeah.
Right. But if you're agnostic of where you want to work, then then I'd say work for a few years in India, because an MIM is also an investment, right?
Yeah.
Work for 2 to 4 years and then apply to an MBA, which I'd say is a better degree, a stronger degree, more recognized, of course, and better job opportunities.
You mentioned cost. So you had scholarships earlier as well. What kind of scholarships did you get, and how much in the percentage terms did those cut down your cost?
So I had a merit bursary, which was about 7 to 10 lakhs, something between that, depending on the exchange rate I apply. And my 1 year fees was about 50. So that was the scholarship I received.
That's pretty significant.
I wouldn't say significant, but it was enough of a swing factor for me to choose a judge over an Oxford.
Pranjal, next I'd like to focus a bit on the placement aspect. As you mentioned, it's unstructured, you have to do a lot of reach out. But can you go a bit deeper into that, such as when did you start making your applications, and how did you become aware of the companies where you could apply? How did you go about shortlisting and then applying to them?
Sure. So to your first question, in a 1-year MBA is of course really intense. Doesn't give you that's the advantage of a 2-year MBA. It doesn't give you that cushion, everything, and it's you're still covering as much ground as you would in a 2-year MBA.
It's just fast.
It's just a lot more intense, a lot happening. So that's that, which therefore means that you start applying literally even before you start the MBA.
Yeah.
I started receiving deadlines before even reaching the UK. Right? So which can be a little, it can be a lot to take, right? Because you haven't started, you're doing a bunch of pre-courses, and then you start applying without having done anything at MBA, and then you're like, how is the MBA even adding value to my applications, right? There's that question which comes up. But yeah, you start applying immediately. I had all of my job offers by February. So my MBA started in September, which is basically through the midpoint, which is a good time to be, right? Which therefore meant that I could really kind of have a blast in the next 6 months. I was absolutely, I was underground in January and December to some extent. And then I was everywhere post-February. So there's always that. And you'll see that during the MBA, you'll see some people reappearing from nowhere. Like you never knew he was a classmate or he or she was a classmate. You're like, dude, who is this guy? And he's been part of your batch all along, but he's been preparing, right?
Yeah.
And then there are different cycles for different companies, right? Typically it's the tech companies first, then the management company, the management consulting. And then there's another tech cycle towards the end of the MBA. So you'll have different people focusing on different aspects. And then therefore, when they do that, they'll be active at different points of the MBA. So that's how the schedule typically works, right? So I'm not going to focus on specificities of which companies come when, because that doesn't make sense for this conversation. How did I go about kind of selecting or shortlisting my companies? Based on whatever I'd done in the past. I'd done consulting in the corporate sector, in the impact sector, and the government space. I kind of knew that I wanted to work in tech. So all of the internships I kind of tried to get or look at, everything I was doing was kind of aimed at tech, right? So, and 2 ways to do it. One is just, again, go on LinkedIn, search for alumni in tech. You'll find a bunch of firms and then kind of go through them and see which works out for you. Or you kind of go through just random Google searches on the country you are in, say UK, top MBA employers in that sector, top summer programs, internships, etc. And then you kind of have a list. That's one. The second is, of course, use your career center. Speak to them. They have a bunch of stuff. And you have your career portal as well. So you leverage that, and then you cold call, create. You also have a bunch of interviews which come via the university.
Yeah.
So it's a function of talking to people cold and some of the interviews that come via the university. Then some of that works out. But I just say that your soft skills are as important, if not more, as much as the hard skills outside of India. So that makes a whole lot of a difference. And if that's something you can work on and polish, you should do that.
Yeah, makes sense. A question about consulting. As an outsider, we see many articles about layoffs in the consulting world. I think mostly at Bain, and but it feels like they're everywhere. So, as an insider, what's your perspective? And what's changed in the especially premium and the MBB world, and how should new people, new aspirants look at it in terms of how their career trajectory should be, and what could they do to prepare better?
So I think that there are a bunch of things, but if I'd say which is the most, I think what has really kind of led to what's happening now, at least in some of the management consultancies that we are seeing, the layoffs, it's happening across the board really, is the fact that these firms had to some extent overhired during the COVID when there was a spike in demand, right? Because there was that significant digital transformation that COVID kind of really catalyzed. And that spike in hiring has then coincided with that dip in business once we are past COVID. And a lot of economies are worse off, not doing as great. There's less demand generally. And these firms having overhired already, there's not as much work, therefore, which then leads to some of the consequences which you just mentioned. And I think more or less some of these firms are at a point where they've reached a stage where it's more sustainable than what it was.
Got it.
A year or so ago.
Not exactly something then that aspirants should be worrying about. They should be focusing on what's in their control. And
I mean, of course, that's something you should keep in mind, right? So,
right, Pranjal, those are all the questions I had for you, and it's been fantastic having you. I think the conversation has been great fun.
Yeah,
and I'm sure.
Likewise, absolutely. It's been for me as well.
Great to hear, and I'm sure it's going to be super helpful for our viewers as well. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
If you have any questions, share them with me in the comments. Stay tuned for more stories and advice from alumni and study abroad experts. Subscribe to Videshi Chai to stay updated.